Welcome to this fourth tutorial video about using RealTest. In this video we're going to look at the data section and how you can use it to calculate indicators, and also the parameter section and how you can use it to vary and optimize a strategy. So here's the script that we finished with at the end of the last video, and as you can see it uses the S&P 500 and is a simple breakout strategy that checks that a stock is in the S&P 500 at the time of entry and enters if the close is greater than the close over the last 20 bars. Now we're going to look at a different kind of strategy, one that doesn't just use something like highest and lowest like this one does, but actually uses an indicator that we're going to define, and we're going to choose the Keltner channels position, which is a very common indicator used by discretionary traders. In order to do that, we need to introduce a new section of the script, and that is the data section. So let's add a data section. And we're going to calculate some new variables from the data that we've loaded for the stock. So we're going to start with the ATR, the average true range, but that's a reserved word in RealTest, so I'm going to call it ATRX, and that's going to be the average true range over the last 20 bars. We're also going to calculate an EMA, also a reserved word, so we're going to call it EMA 20, and that's going to be the exponential moving average of the close over the last 20 bars. And finally, we're going to calculate the KPOS, the Keltner channel position, which is the difference between the close and the EMA divided by the number of ATRs. So this effectively gives us the number of ATRs away that closes from the EMA. So now we're going to use those values to calculate the actual channels. So I'm going to start by defining K1, the first Keltner channel, as the EMA, and then I'm going to add to that 1 times the ATR. And now I'm going to replicate that a few times. K2 and K3 are going to be the Keltner channels, which are 2 ATRs away and 3 ATRs away from the EMA as well. And I also want to have channels that are below the EMA, so I'm going to just copy and paste those. And we can't call this K-1 because RealTest can't have symbols in variable names, so I'm going to call it K-1, -2 and -3, and those are simply going to be the EMA subtracting 1, 2 or 3 ATRs. And to check that we've got this correct, we're going to click Apply. So imagine that the data that RealTest has loaded for all the stocks is in memory, and it's like a giant spreadsheet. So here, for example, I've got the data for stock A, and I've got AAL here, and AAP here, and so on. And for each stock, I've got the date, the open, high, low, close, and volume. And when we create a data section in RealTest's script, what it's actually doing is effectively adding a new column to this giant spreadsheet that we can imagine it as in memory. So we've been adding ATRX, an ATR for 20 period, an EMA 20, a variable called KPOS, and then our various Keltner channels, K1, K2, and so on. And effectively what RealTest is doing is, and I won't bother putting the formula in here, but it's using the data here to calculate a particular formula that works out the average true range for all of these values, then the EMA 20, the KPOS, and so on. And it's doing it first for this stock, then for the next stock, and the next, and the next. So when we create a data section, what we're actually doing is getting RealTest to create a whole load of calculations of variables in memory before we run our test. Having done that, we're now going to actually define the channels on a chart so that we can see if we've got this correct. So I'm going to put a new section in, Charts, where I define which variables I want to actually show on the chart. So we're very simply going to put the K1 variable, the K2 variable, the K3 variable, the EMA, the K-1 variable, the K-2, and the K-3. Now let's see whether that actually has calculated correctly by plotting it on a chart. And you can see I've got a date here, the end of August, and I've got a symbol, A. And I'm going to click here to actually view the chart, and because we specified those variables on the chart section of the script, we've now got them added to the chart, K1, K2, K3, the EMA, the -1, -2 and -3 channels. And you should be able to see that this gives a fairly good indication. When a stock is trending up, it tends to sit in the higher channels, and if it trends down, if there's a downtrend, it tends to move across to the lower channels. And so this is often used as an indication of whether a stock is trending, some kind of indication of momentum. One of the nice factors of it is that when a stock turns, it climbs through the Keltner channels a little bit faster than an EMA would normally react. And so by looking at the position within the Keltner channels, you can kind of get an earlier indication of something actually being trending. So we're going to use that now to actually develop a script that takes advantage of that. So back to the script, and we're going to first of all take out our exit. We no longer want to exit on the lowest breakdown, but we've still got exit limits at 20% above and an exit stop at 10% below the fill price. And our entry setup is now going to be that the stock is in the S&P 500, but also that the lowest value of the position, the K position, the position of the close within the Keltner channels over the last 50 bars is greater than -1. In other words, going back to our chart here, we don't want to enter where we've got something breaking down well below this -1, but once price starts to stay above this -1 level, once it closes above that level, then we are happy to define this as being an upwards trend, and at that point we're happy to enter. And we've still got our entry score here, so it ranks those stocks with the highest percentage change over the past 100 bars as the ones that are most likely to be entered at the top of our list. So now we can click test, and RealTest runs that. So it's calculating it, and when we go to look at the results, here we go. We've got a rate of return of 15% and a maximum drawdown of just -18%. So not a bad start to our strategy. Let's take a little look now at what's going on behind the scenes when we clicked test. So you may recall that RealTest can use data from a source like Yahoo, or in this case Norgate, and when we click the import button, it loads all the data for that stock across the dates that you've specified into memory, and once it's in memory it can save it out to an RTD file and load it back in if required. Also in memory is the actual script file, and that contains various sections that we've looked at, such as the strategy section, where you actually define what it's going to do on each bar, and a section we haven't looked at yet, the library section, and another one, the parameters, and then the one we've just demonstrated, which is the data section, and I'm going to put that down the bottom because it kind of fits with the process more. So when you decide to start a test, you click the test button, and RealTest does the following. First of all, it checks to see if it has the symbol data required for all the stocks in memory, and if it's not in memory, then it loads it from the RTD file. And secondly, if you've defined a data section, it then calculates all the data section in one go. And it does that rather like when we were adding the extra columns into the Excel sheet that we saw before. And having done that, it places it into memory alongside the symbol data, where it's really quick to access. Very importantly, RealTest only loads symbol data and only does the data calculations if it doesn't have those already in memory. So it's not going to repeat this process every time you press the test button. In fact, sometimes when you press the test button, it won't do either of those because you'd already pressed the apply button, perhaps to check that your script was syntactically correct, in which case, when you click apply, it actually loads all the symbol data and calculates any data sections that haven't been calculated already and then stops. But let's imagine we've clicked the test button. Once it's done those two things, it has everything in memory, it then goes on and uses that data and runs the test. And from there, it outputs the results. Now, let's talk about those two sections that we hadn't come across before. The library section is actually just like the data section. It enables you to define a formula for a particular variable, but unlike the data section, it doesn't place all of that data into memory and it doesn't pre-calculate it. It's kind of just like a lookup of particular functions that it can use. And the reason you might want to use those, that's varied, but one of the reasons you might want to use a library section is if you don't actually want to do a calculation for every single stock because it's referencing something that is maybe the market itself. The parameter section is a little different. It's where you would typically store numbers which affect how the script is going to work, but you don't want them to change during the test. So you can imagine it's a bit like a number of dials that you can use to set various properties of the script, and you might want to change them when you're doing backtesting, but once set, you keep them like that for the whole test. You may remember in a previous video we talked about being able to optimize. Well, the process of using the optimize button actually effectively alters those dials one notch at a time. It changes the values and reruns the test each time. So let's go in and define a parameter section now in our script and see how that can work. What I'd like to do here is actually test to see whether this taking profits at a limit at 20% above the fill price is actually a good value. And to do that, I'm going to define a parameter section. So parameters, and I'm only going to define one parameter, which is exit limit factor. And now we need to tell RealTest what we want for that factor. So at the moment, I could just define that as 1.2 and replace this here as exit limit factor. And if I run that test, that will give me exactly the same results as we had before. But one of the big advantages of the parameter section is that you can go in and change this if you want to just rerun the test with 1.1 and see what the results are like, or you can get RealTest to actually test a number of values, and that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to tell it to test from 1.02 to 1.4, and we're going to tell it to go up each time by 0.02. So it's going to start at 1.02, in other words 2% above the entry value, and then it's going to add another 0.02 to that, so that'll be 4% above the entry value, and so on. And it'll only do this if we actually use the optimize button. If we just click the test button here, then it will just use the first value, 2% above. But I'm now going to click the optimize button, and I'm going to check the box for this exit limit factor. We could actually define multiple parameters and have several that we test at the same time if we want to. By default, it's going to clear the results window and run these individual tests one after the other. So let's do that and I'll explain what's going on. So I'm running the tests, and if I click onto the results window, you can see it's running the first one, and here is our parameter. So it started off with 1.02, 2% of above the fill price, then 1.04, 1.06, 1.08, and each time, and this is the beauty of how fast RealTest is, each time it is running the complete test and giving us the results here. And it will carry on through till 1.4, at which point it's going to stop and we'll have all the results together. So let's fast forward to that point now. And here we are. Here are all the 20 results from the various tests that will run automatically through the optimize button. And I can browse through them, look at the different rate of return, the different drawdown. I can very easily sort by these as well. So if I want to look at what the range of drawdown was, well, the worst was 30% and the best was 17%. One of the columns that I often sort by is actually the Sharpe ratio. So if I sort by the Sharpe ratio, then I can see that the best values were ones where I actually got a Sharpe ratio of just over 1. And I can go back and sort by test number if I want them in the original order. Now this is all very well and good, very useful, but it's sometimes easier to visualize these things on a graph. And to do that, you right click anywhere on here and click Show Optimization Graph. And now we can very quickly see the range of the different profits that we were getting. And we can see that these two were very high, but perhaps they were a little bit of an outlier since we have one in the middle there. And we can use the arrow keys to go through and look at things like the maximum drawdown, the number of trades. As you can see, the further away the limit order is, the less trades we get because the longer we're staying in the positions that we have. The percentage of wins, obviously when you have a very, very small close limit order, you get a lot of wins, but they're not very high, and they go down. If we keep going through, we can look at the expectancy. The expectancy starts incredibly small, but by the time we go up, it actually gets to be a much more acceptable level, and the Sharpe ratio. And so what you're using this for generally is not to look for which is the absolute best result, but to look at how stable the values are and roughly where the range of good values are. So in this case, actually, we started with a 20% take a profit. We probably want something around about the middle here as being one of the better values. I wouldn't expect to get results as good as that 20% limit order because this is one of just 2 of the best results. But it does at least show us that we're roughly in the right ballpark, that the expectancy around 1.2 is reasonable. You know, we're certainly well above 1% at 4%, and that we have a nice rate of return, and the drawdown is an acceptable level. We're probably going to expect drawdowns that are more like this sort of 20-25% range. So there you have it. We've defined a data section and talked about how to actually create new variables and indicators that we can then place on charts to work out what would be a good strategy. And we've looked at a very simple strategy where you're actually looking for the position in the Keltner channels to have been consistently for 50 bars to have been above -1, which indicates that we're in an uptrend, and then we're taking profits, and we've discussed how to take a particular parameter and work out whether that parameter is stable and what the best range of values might be for that parameter. A very simple way of actually working out how to develop a strategy and how to improve it as you go along. And obviously we could define a number of other parameters here, like the exit stop factor, maybe the number of bars that we're actually looking over to decide whether we're going to get an entry, and so on. Would I trade this strategy? Well, it's a good start for something as simplistic as a Keltner channel one. And if we take a look at the 1.2 profit factor, which was bang in the middle here, we can see that it's a reasonable sort of equity curve. There are a few years where we just seem to go sideways for some time, and obviously it's very easy to trend up during this period where the market was basically trending up in general. So we'd maybe want to have a little bit of an investigation and see what happens in times of more market stress. The drawdown is quite large, it's a little bit larger than the return. I'm not sure it's something I would trade, but it's certainly an interesting exercise and certainly worth looking at to learn how to use this data section and vary parameters through the optimization system. So there we go. The data section in RealTest is a great way for you to define variables which RealTest pre-calculates and puts in memory, which makes backtesting much faster. We also looked at the parameter section, which is where you can define things that are going to vary how your strategy works and how to optimize using those parameters. In the next video, we'll take a look at a more detailed kind of strategy. But for now, thanks for watching.